The stag's blood steamed where it struck the snow, and Garrick Stain planted his boot on the beast's antlers and pointed his skinning knife straight at Lash Wildheart's throat as though she were the second kill of the morning. 3 days I hunted the highland ghost that no man in this hold has felled in a generation, he bellowed, loud enough that his voice rolled off the timber walls of Fjordholt and echoed down toward the black water of the fjord below. The Huntrite is mine. She is mine. The whole hold had turned out for it, bundled in furs along the palisade and the frozen yard, breath rising in pale clouds, and Lash stood in the center of them with her chin lifted and her dark eyes narrowed, refusing to so much as flinch at the knife pointed her way. She wore her fitted warrior leathers, the dark tan bodice laced tight up the front of her powerful frame, a fur-trimmed pauldron riding one broad shoulder, a wide belt cinched at her waist with a curved seeks sheathed against her hip, and a mantle of gray wolf fur clasped at her throat with a carved bone pin. Snow had caught in her dark hair where it fell loose past her shoulders, and she looked in that moment like something carved from the mountain itself and given breath. "Mine," Garrick said again, reaching for her wrist. "No." The word cracked across the yard before Jacob Maddox had even decided to say it. He was already moving, the ceremonial ledger clutched in both hands, the leather-bound record of the Huntrite's laws that Jarl Osric Vane himself had charged him to keep as steward of these very arrangements. Her quarters, her escort, her wedding, all of it, down to the ink and the wax. He had spent 3 months arranging every hour of Lash Wildheart's life in this hold, and he had never once raised his voice to any man in it. He raised it now. "You did not win the Huntrite," Jacob said, stepping between Garrick's outstretched hand and Lash's wrist, close enough that he could feel the animal heat still rolling off the dead stag. "Pell Ashwood saw your men drive that beast into the North Ravine and pin it there 2 days past. You did not stalk it alone across 3 days as the law requires. You trapped it and you waited and you struck it down where it could not run. That is not the Huntrite. That is slaughter." The yard went silent enough to hear the wind moving through the pines below the palisade. Garrick's face went the color of a bruise. "You would take the word of a boy over the word of your champion, Steward. I would take the truth over a lie, whoever tells it." Jacob's hands were shaking. He could feel them shaking, could feel how absurd he must look, a slight man in a steward's plain wool coat standing chest to chest with the biggest warrior in Fjordholt, but he did not step back. He opened the ledger to the page he had bookmarked with a strip of red cloth, and held it up so the gathered hold could see the words written there in his own careful hand. "It is written here in the law you yourself swore to when you entered the trial. A fair chase alone across no fewer than 3 days. I will not put my seal to a claim built on a lie. I will not hand her to you. Then who will you hand me to, Steward?" Lash's voice came low and amused, cutting clean through the tension the way a blade cuts through hide, and when Jacob turned to look at her, she was watching him with an expression he had never once seen on her in all the weeks he had known her, not challenge, not mockery, but something that looked almost like recognition, as if she had been waiting the whole while to see exactly this. "No one," Jacob said, before he could stop himself. "I will not hand you to anyone." It had begun 3 months earlier, on a morning so cold the fjord itself had crusted white at its edges, when Jarl Osric Vane called Jacob into the long hall and told him that the Wildheart clan's envoy was 3 days out from the eastern pass, bringing the chieftain's own daughter as a bride to seal the peace between their 2 peoples. Jacob had been steward of Fjordholt for going on 4 years by then, ever since he had walked out of the gates of the cloister of St. Bren in the lowlands with nothing but a satchel of clothes and a restlessness he had never been able to name to any of the brothers who had raised him from a boy. He had taken no final vows. He had simply understood, one gray morning while sweeping the chapel floor, that the quiet life he had been given was not the life he wanted, and that some part of him had been waiting his whole life for a door to open onto something larger, though he could not have said what. He had walked north with the little coin he had saved from tending the cloister's herb garden, and Fjordholt had taken him in because the old steward had died of a winter fever, and no one else in the hold could read or reckon figures worth a damn. He had made himself useful in the plain, patient way he had learned from years of cloister discipline, and in time the hold had come to trust him with everything from the granary stores to the succession of the Jarl's own hounds. He was 30 years old, unmarried, a little too quiet for the taverns, and a little too worldly now for prayer, and he had long since made his peace with the notion that he was a man built for arranging other people's lives rather than living one of his own. "You will see to everything," Jarl Osric had told him, tapping a thick finger against the treaty scroll on the table between them. "Her quarters, her escort, the wedding to Garrick when the time comes. The Wildheart clan has bled us, and we have bled them for 3 generations along that eastern ridge, and this marriage buys us peace we cannot win with steel. See that nothing goes wrong, Maddox. Nothing." Jacob had said yes, because saying yes to the Jarl was the whole of his position in the world, and he had gone about the business of preparing a chamber and a wardrobe and a marriage feast for a woman he had never met and could not begin to imagine. Nothing had prepared him for the day she rode through the gates. The whole hold had turned out to watch, the way they turned out for any spectacle, and there was no mistaking the hostility in it. Old women spitting into the snow, men gripping axe hafts they had no cause to be carrying, children hushed and stared with the particular cruelty of the very young. 3 generations of raids and reprisals along the eastern ridge did not wash away because a treaty scroll said they should, and Jacob had felt the ugliness of it in his own chest, even as he stood at the gate in his steward's coat with the welcome speech. He had written and rewritten a dozen times, folded in his pocket. Then Lash Wildheart came through the gate on a shaggy highland pony far too small for her frame, and every carefully rehearsed word went out of Jacob's head at once. She was magnificent. There was no other word for it. She sat the pony as though she owned the ground it walked on, her green-gray skin weathered by wind and sun, her dark hair bound back in 3 thick braids threaded with bronze rings, her jaw strong and her eyes black and sharp as a hawk's. She wore the same fitted leathers she would wear every day after, the laced bodice, the fur-trimmed shoulder, the wide belt and the curved seeks, the wolf fur mantle thrown back despite the cold as if she scorned to hide from it. She looked at the hostile crowd with the flat, unbothered contempt of a woman who had faced far worse than dirty looks from frightened farmers, and when Jarl Osric stepped forward with his own rehearsed speech of welcome, she did not so much as glance at him. Her eyes had found Jacob instead, standing a little apart with his ledger clutched to his chest, and she had swung down off the pony and crossed the yard directly to him, ignoring the Jarl mid-sentence, ignoring Garrick Stain standing beside him in his finest bearskin cloak, clearly expecting to be greeted as the groom. "You," she said, stopping close enough that Jacob had to tip his head back to meet her eyes. "You are the one who arranged all this." Yes, Jacob Maddox, steward of the hold. I have prepared your quarters and a schedule for the days before thee. I do not care about a schedule." She said it without malice, simply as fact, the way one might observe that the sky was gray. "I care that you are the first man in this whole miserable frozen yard who looks at me like I am a person and not a treaty." Jacob had no answer for that. He had simply stood there, feeling something in his chest turn over like a key in a long rusted lock, while behind her Garrick Stain's face went dark with the particular fury of a proud man overlooked in front of his own hold. He had thought foolishly that it would pass, that she was simply testing the ground, the way any stranger might, and that once she settled into the rhythms of Fjordholt, she would turn her attention, where the treaty demanded it, toward Garrick, toward the marriage that was supposed to buy peace for 2 war-weary peoples. He arranged her chamber with furs and a proper hearth. He arranged for a woman of the hold to teach her the customs of the wedding feast. He arranged an escort to walk her through the market stalls so the townsfolk might grow used to seeing her, and a schedule of meetings with Garrick so the 2 of them might, in the Jarl's words, "grow accustomed to one another before the vows." Lash ignored every one of these arrangements with a thoroughness that would have been comical if it had not been terrifying to a steward whose whole worth lay in things going according to plan. She skipped the sewing lessons to climb the palisade wall and watch the fjord ships instead. She sat through exactly one supper with Garrick before informing the Jarl, in front of the whole hall, that she found the man's conversation duller than a rock and twice as thick, and thereafter refused to sit beside him at all. She wandered off from her assigned escort at the market to haggle, in halting trade tongue, over a knife she liked the look of, and came back an hour later with the knife and no apology. And everywhere Jacob went, trying to smooth over the wreckage of his careful plans, he found her waiting. "You look tired, Steward," she told him one gray afternoon, finding him bent over the granary ledgers in the little stone storehouse that served as his office, 3 weeks after her arrival. She had taken to simply walking into whatever room he occupied, as though the whole hold belonged to her and every door in it opened at her pleasure. "I have a great deal to arrange," Jacob said, not looking up, though his pulse had already quickened at the sound of her voice. "The wedding feast alone requires—" "I did not ask you to arrange a wedding feast." She came around the table and perched herself on the edge of it, close enough that he could smell wood smoke and cold air on her leathers. "I asked the Jarl for time to prove myself worthy of choosing my own husband, and he gave me a hunt instead of an answer because he thinks Garrick will win it easily and the matter will be settled without my having to agree to anything. But you keep arranging around me as if the matter is already settled." "Why?" Jacob set down his quill very carefully. "Because it is my duty." "Is that the only reason?" He looked up then, and found her watching him with that same unbearable directness she had worn since the gate, dark eyes searching his face without a shred of the shyness or deference the rest of the hold offered her, as though she found him worth studying and did not care who knew it. "No," he admitted, because he had never once been able to lie to her, not from the very first day. "It is not the only reason, but it is the reason I am permitted to have." Lash smiled then, slow and dangerous, the kind of smile that made Jacob's mouth go dry. "Permitted." She said the word like it tasted foul. "Jacob Maddox, I have crossed 3 mountain ranges and buried 2 cousins along the way to be handed to a man who trapped a rabbit once and calls it hunting, and you speak to me of what you are permitted." She leaned in, close enough now that he could see the small scar above her left eyebrow, could count the bronze rings threaded through her braids. "I do not care what you are permitted, Steward. I care what you want." "That is a dangerous question to ask a man in my position," Jacob said, his voice not quite steady. "Good." She reached out and tucked one loose strand of his hair back from his brow, the touch light and shocking, and gone again before he could even flinch away from it. "I like dangerous." He had not slept that night or many nights after. The huntrite had been Lash's own idea, though the Jarl had seized on it eagerly enough once she proposed it. A compromise struck in the great hall in front of both households, when Lash flatly refused to be handed over to Garrick Stain without so much as the appearance of a choice. If the men of Fjordholt wished to prove their worth to an orc chieftain's daughter, she had said, let them prove it against the mountain, not against her father's spear count. Let whichever man among them slew the great highland stag, the pale ghost of a beast that had haunted the high ridges for 2 decades and killed 3 hunters who had gone after it, earn her hand by the old custom, fair chase, 3 days, no traps, no poison, no help. She had meant it, Jacob understood later, as a delay, a way of buying herself time to find some way out of a marriage she had never wanted. She had not meant for it to become a genuine contest that half the eligible men of the hold entered, hungry for glory and a chieftain's daughter both. Jacob had not entered. He owned no bow worth the name and had never in his life stalked anything larger than a hare, and besides, the organizing of the whole business fell to him. The provisioning, the boundary markers on the map, the recording of each hunter's route and return. It was, he told himself grimly, simply one more arrangement to manage, One more task to bury himself in so he would not have to sit with the plain, unbearable fact that in 3 days' time, one way or another, Lash Wildheart would belong to another man. The night before the hunters set out, she came to find him in the storehouse again, and this time she did not perch on the edge of his table. She shut the door behind her, dropped the bar across it, and crossed the little room until there was no space left between them at all. "Say it," she said. "Say what? Whatever it is you have been swallowing every time you look at me like that." Her hand came up to rest flat against his chest, over his thudding heart, and he was fairly certain she could feel exactly how hard it was hammering. "I am leaving this hold in 3 days as another man's wife if the mountain does not swallow him first, and I will not spend my last free nights pretending I do not know what I want. Lash, say it, Jacob." He had never once heard her say his name without the title attached to it, not once in 3 months, and hearing it now, bare and low in hers, undid something in him that 4 years of steady steward's discipline could not hold back. "I do not want to hand you to him," Jacob said, the words tearing out of him at last. "I have not wanted it since the first morning you rode through that gate and looked at me like I was worth looking at. I arrange your wedding by day and I lie awake hating myself for it by night, because you are the first thing in this whole cold hold that has ever felt like it was meant for me, and I cannot have you, and I have made my peace with it 100 times and lost that peace again 100 times more." "Then stop making peace with it," Lash said, and kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss. She kissed him the way she did everything, with her whole self, fierce and certain. One hand fisted in the front of his coat, and the other cradling his jaw as though she were afraid he might pull away, though he had no intention on any earth of doing so. He kissed her back with 4 years of loneliness breaking open at once, and when they finally parted, both of them breathing hard in the lamplit dark of the storehouse, she pressed her brow to his and laughed, low and startled, as though the kiss had surprised even her with its force. "There," she murmured. "Now you cannot pretend you did not choose." "I never chose anything," Jacob said. "You are the one who ignored every arrangement I made and chose me instead." "Then I am choosing you again," she said, "and I will keep choosing you until you stop looking so afraid of it." He had not stopped being afraid, not that night, and not 3 days later when Garrick Stain strode into the yard with the great stag's carcass over his shoulders and Jacob's whole careful world came apart at the seams over a torn page in a ledger. The confrontation in the yard did not end the way Jacob expected. He had thought in the wild, unthinking rush of the moment, tearing the page free of its binding and thrusting it toward Garrick's face like a shield, that the truth alone would be enough. Pell Ashwood, white-faced and trembling, confirmed before the whole gathered hold what he had told Jacob in secret, that he had watched Garrick's men drive the ghost stag into the North Ravine with torches and drums 2 full days before the killing blow, penning it against the rock face until it could no longer run. The old hunters of the hold, men who remembered what the Huntrite had always meant before Garrick's father had ever set foot in Fjordholt, muttered low and ugly among themselves, and even Jarl Osric's face had gone tight with the particular fury of a man who knows he has been made a fool of in front of his own people. But Garrick Stain did not simply concede. He backhanded Pell Ashwood into the snow for speaking, and when Jacob moved to help the boy up, Garrick's fist caught him across the jaw hard enough to drop him to one knee, the ledger flying from his hands. "You would humiliate me over the word of a boy and the meddling of a steward with no more claim to her than a dog has to the moon," Garrick spat, standing over Jacob with his knife still bare in his hand. "I will have what is mine, treaty or no treaty, boy's tale or no boy's tale." That was when Lash moved. Jacob would remember it for the rest of his life, the sheer speed of her, closing the distance before Garrick had finished his sentence, one hand closing around his knife wrist and wrenching it wide, the other driving into his chest hard enough to send a man twice Jacob's size staggering back into the snow. She stood over Garrick now, her cheeks drawn and gleaming, her whole body coiled and furious. "Touch him again," she said, in a voice gone low and terrible, and I will show this whole hold exactly why the Wildheart clan is not a name men speak lightly on the eastern ridge." The yard held its breath. Jarl Osric stepped forward at last, his own guards closing in around the tangle of bodies, and it was only his raised hand and his roar of "enough" that kept blades from being drawn on every side at once. What followed was not a trial by combat, though for one terrible heartbeat Jacob had thought it might come to that. It was, instead, a reckoning delivered in the cold, clear light of the yard, with the whole hold as witness. Jarl Osric, gray-faced and furious at having his treaty and his authority both made a public spectacle, stripped Garrick of his claim to the Huntrite. The evidence of the trap, once spoken aloud before so many witnesses, could not be unheard, whatever fury it cost him. But the Jarl's anger did not end there. He rounded on Jacob next, his steward of 4 loyal years, and there was nothing in his eyes now but cold calculation. "You have made yourself a fool over an orc bride not your own, Maddox," Jarl Osric said, loud enough for the whole yard to hear. "You have humiliated my champion, thrown my own laws in my face in front of an envoy I cannot afford to offend, and made yourself the center of a peace treaty that was never meant to have your name anywhere upon it. I cannot have a steward who serves his own heart before his hold." He drew a slow breath, and Jacob felt the axe of it fall before the words themselves. "You are stripped of your stewardship. You will leave Fjordholt within the day, and you will not return." "He acted rightly," Lash said, before Jacob could even find his voice. "He told the truth when every other man in this yard would have swallowed it to keep his position. If you punish him for that, you punish the only honest man you have. This is not your hold to govern, girl," Jarl Osric snapped, and the endearment landed like an insult in the cold air. "Then perhaps it should not be mine to marry into either," Lash said, and her voice carried to every corner of the yard. "I did not come 3 mountain ranges to wed a man who cheats a hunt and beats a boy for speaking truth, nor to bow to a jarl who would rather protect his own pride than his own laws. I withdraw from the arrangement, Osric Vane, treaty or no treaty. Send word to my father that his daughter chose honor over convenience, and see how he answers you for it." The threat in that landed harder than any blade could have. The peace with the Wildheart clan hung on this marriage, and everyone in that yard knew it, knew that Chieftain Cordeth Wildheart had sent his own daughter as the price of ending 3 generations of bloodshed along the eastern ridge, and that her open refusal, spoken before witnesses, could unravel it entirely. Jarl Osric's jaw worked for a long moment before he found an answer that let him keep some shred of his authority intact. "The steward leaves the hold," he said at last, flat and final. "That much does not change. If you choose to go with him, Lash Wildheart, that is your affair and your father's to reckon with, not mine. I will send word to the eastern ridge that the bride treaty is broken by the bride's own choice, and let the consequences fall where they will. But I will not have it said that Fjordholt drove her out. She may go where she pleases." "Then I please to go with him," Lash said, without a heartbeat's hesitation, and crossed the yard to stand at Jacob's side in front of the whole silent, staring hold. They left before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, Jacob with nothing but the satchel he had carried into the hold 4 years before, and a little coin he had saved, Lash with her pony, her Sikhs, and the wolf-fur mantle wrapped tight against a wind that carried the first bite of a coming storm. Jarl Osric had granted them, with grim reluctance, the use of a border watchpost 2 days' ride into the high passes, an old stone tower manned once a season by hunters checking the boundary markers, empty now until spring. On the condition that Jacob understood plainly, he was not being given shelter out of forgiveness, but out of a jarl's unwillingness to have a dead steward and a dead chieftain's daughter both laid at his door before the snows even broke. "He thinks he is doing us no kindness," Lash said, as they climbed the winding track above the fjord, the black water falling away below them, the pines closing in white and heavy with snow on either side. "But I would take a stone tower with you over a longhouse with any other man in that whole miserable hold. "You say that now," Jacob said, though he could not keep the small smile from his voice. "Wait until the storms come in. I have weathered worse storms than a highland tower can throw at me." She had not, as it turned out, weathered quite this one. They reached the watchpost by the second evening, a squat gray tower of dry-stacked stone with a single hearth-room below and a loft above, provisioned with dried meat and firewood enough for a lean season, but not, Jacob privately suspected, for two people through a hard one. They had barely gotten the pony stabled in the lean-to, and the first fire lit when the sky over the western ridge turned the color of a bruise, and the wind began to scream through the pass with a violence that made the old stones groan. "Get inside," Jacob shouted over it, hauling the last of their supplies through the door, and had barely gotten the heavy bar across it when the world outside turned white and roaring. The avalanche came sometime in the deep of that first night. They heard it before they understood what it was, a sound like the mountain itself breaking, followed by a shudder that ran up through the stone floor and rattled the shutters in their frames. Jacob had been outside not an hour before, checking the pony, and it was only Lash's hand closing hard around his arm and hauling him bodily back through the door, her whole body curling protectively over his, as a wall of displaced snow and broken timber from the lean-to roof came crashing down not 20 feet from where they stood, that kept him from being caught in the open. "Are you hurt?" she demanded, pinning him against the inside of the stone wall with her own body between him and the shattered doorway, her breath coming hard, her hands running over his shoulders and his ribs as though she could not quite believe he was whole. "No, no, I am fine, you." He caught her face in both hands, made her look at him, both of them shaking with adrenaline in the howling dark. "You could have been buried, Lash. You should not have. I would rather be buried beside you than safe without you," she said, fierce and unrepentant, and then more quietly pressing her brow to his the way she had that first night in the storehouse. "Do not tell me what I should have done, Jacob Maddox. I have made my choice. I will go on making it, every time, for as long as I draw breath." The avalanche had taken the lean-to roof in half, buried the track back down the mountain in rubble and packed snow, sealing them into that stone tower more completely than any locked door could have managed. It would be, they discovered over the grim, wind-battered days that followed, nearly 3 weeks before the pass cleared enough for travel, 3 weeks with no word from the hold, no way down, nothing but each other, a hearth fire, and the long white silence of the high mountains pressing in on every side. It should have been a hardship. In many ways it was. The food had to be carefully rationed, the firewood split and stacked with a steward's careful eye toward scarcity, the cold at night fierce enough that they slept close by the hearth wrapped in every fur they owned. But Jacob would remember those 3 weeks, after everything, as the truest happiness he had ever known. They talked, in those long snowbound evenings, in a way the frantic weeks at Fjordholt had never allowed. Lash told him of her mother, dead these 10 years past in a raid along the very ridge that had made her people and Jacob's people enemies, and of her father Cordath, who had sent her south not merely to buy peace, but because he had grown so weary of watching his warriors die on both sides of a border, neither people even remembered the original cause of any more. She told him of the 2 cousins she had buried on the road south, of the weight of being a chieftain's daughter expected to solve with her own marriage what 40 years of raiding had failed to solve with steel. Jacob told her of the cloister, of the particular ache of growing up surrounded by kind men who had nonetheless never once made him feel he belonged among them, of the restlessness that had driven him out into a world he had not been at all prepared for, and of the strange, patient loneliness of 4 years spent making himself useful to a hold that valued his ledgers far more than his company. "They were fools," Lash said one such evening, her head resting against his shoulder in the firelight, her fingers laced loosely through his. "All of them. Every person who ever looked at you and saw only a man good for keeping accounts." "I was not so unhappy," Jacob said. "I had a purpose." I told myself that was enough. And is it enough now? He turned his head, found her watching him with the firelight caught gold in her dark eyes, and understood that she was not asking about ledgers at all. No, he admitted. It has not been enough for a long time. Not since a woman rode through a gate on a pony too small for her and looked at me as though I mattered. You do matter, Lash said, fierce and low, cupping his jaw in one strong hand. You matter more than any treaty, any hold, any hunt. I have crossed mountains and buried kin, and defied my own father's peace to sit in this cold tower with you, Jacob Maddox, and I would do it all again 100 times over rather than spend one more day pretending some other man's name belonged in my mouth. What came after that was not hurried, though the wanting between them had crackled since the very first day at the gate. It was slow and certain, the way the mountain snow settles deep and undisturbed, both of them peeling back the careful walls they had each built for entirely different reasons. His out of years of quiet cloistered discipline and Steward's restraint, hers out of a warrior's guarded pride that had never before found a man she trusted enough to lower it for. She undid the laces of her own bodice with steady hands and let him see, for the first time, not the warrior the whole hold had feared and stared at, but simply Lash, warm and unguarded in the firelight, and Jacob had never in his life felt so entirely, unbearably wanted as he did in the hush of that stone tower with the storm howling forgotten outside, and her mouth finding his own again and again like a woman coming home. When at last they lay tangled together beneath the firs, her strong arm heavy and possessive across his chest, her breath slow and even against his throat, Jacob understood that whatever had been missing in him for 30 quiet years had finally, entirely been found. Mine, she murmured once, half asleep, pressing a slow kiss to his shoulder. Say it back. Yours, Jacob said, and meant it more completely than he had ever meant any vow he had almost taken in a cloister chapel a lifetime ago. The pass cleared on the 22nd day, the sun breaking hard and bright over snow so deep it swallowed sound, and it was into that brightness that the riders came. Jacob heard the hoofbeats first, echoing strange and wrong off the rock walls of the narrowing pass below the tower, and by the time he had grabbed the old boar spear left hanging by the door, the only weapon the watchpost had ever kept, meant for wolves, not men, Lash was already outside on the packed snow, seeks drawn, standing between him and whatever was coming with the same unthinking speed she had shown in the yard at Fjordholt. It was Garrick Stain. He had 6 men with him, hard-faced border riders in boiled leather and iron-studded coats, and behind them, unhorsed and walking with his hands bound before him between 2 of the riders, was a face Jacob recognized with a lurch of dread, Pell Ashwood, the boy who had told the truth in the yard, and paid for it with a split lip, now dragged along as a prisoner and a warning both. Jarl Osric's word was that we might leave in peace, Jacob called out, his voice steadier than his racing heart had any right to be. This is not his justice you are carrying out, Garrick. This is only yours. Osric Vane is a coward who lost his nerve the moment an orc girl raised her voice at him, Garrick said, swinging down from his horse. His jaw was still faintly discolored from where Jacob's ledger-page confrontation had cost him his prize in front of the whole hold, and there was a wildness in his eyes now that had nothing to do with reason. But his laws are not the only laws in this country. I hunted the ghost stag, Steward. I earned my claim, and a boy's lie and a jarl's weak stomach do not undo that in the eyes of any man who still respects the old ways. I have come to take what is mine, and I have brought this liar so he might watch what his tale-telling cost. You will not touch him, Lash said, moving between Garrick and Pell without a heartbeat's hesitation, her seek steady in her hand. I have no quarrel with the boy today, Garrick said, and his eyes slid instead, cold and deliberate, to Jacob. My quarrel is with the man who made a fool of me in front of my own hold and stole a bride I bled for on the mountain. He drew his sword, a real blade, not a hunting knife, and 2 of his men closed in on either side of Jacob before Lash could move, one seizing his arm, The cold edge of a knife suddenly pressed flat against the pulse of his throat. No, Lash's whole body went rigid, the Sikh's trembling in her white-knuckled grip. "Drop the blade," Garrick said, "or I will open his throat right here on the snow, and you may go on being the free woman you seem to prize so highly, but you will do it a widow before you were ever properly a wife." Jacob felt the knife's edge, felt the man's breath hot and sour against his ear, and understood with a strange, distant clarity that he was, in fact, about to die on a mountain pass over a marriage he had never even sought to steal, only refused to help complete. He did not look at the knife, he looked at Lash. "Do not," he said, as steadily as he could manage with a blade at his throat. "Whatever he offers, Lash, do not." "Be silent," Garrick snapped. But Lash was already moving, and what she did next Jacob would carry with him for the rest of his life as the single bravest thing he had ever witnessed. She let the Sikhs fall from her hand into the snow. "Take me instead," she said, loud and clear and utterly without a tremor, her empty hands spread wide, her eyes never once leaving Jacob's face even as she addressed the man holding the knife to his throat. "You wanted the Wildheart chieftain's daughter as your prize, Garrick Stain. Here I am. Bind me, drag me back to Fjordholt, stand me before the whole hold and call me your bride if it feeds whatever is starving in you, but let him go. He was never yours to punish. This was always between you and me, and I am giving you exactly what you claim you earned. Take it, let him live." "Lash, no," Jacob's voice cracked on her name, horror closing his throat tighter than any knife. "Hush," she said, and her eyes finally found his, steady and fierce and terribly gentle all at once. "I told you in that tower I would choose you again and again for as long as I drew breath. I am choosing you now. Living, Jacob. I need you living far more than I need you free." Garrick's grip on his sword had gone uncertain, some old instinct warring visibly across his face, greed and pride pulling one way, and beneath them, some last unburied scrap of the man he might have been before ambition curdled him, pulling the other. "You would truly walk back to that hold in chains for him?" "Every step," Lash said. "Gladly." It was in that breath of hesitation, that single unguarded heartbeat while Garrick weighed a bound bride against a dead steward, that Jacob understood he was not going to simply stand there and let her trade her whole life for his. 4 years of a steward's patient stillness had taught him how to watch and wait and calculate a room, and he used every scrap of that training now. Noting the man holding him had shifted his weight forward to hear Garrick's answer, noting the knife's edge had eased fractionally from his throat as its holder's attention wandered toward the drama unfolding before him. Jacob drove his elbow back hard into the man's ribs, twisted free of the loosened grip, and threw himself bodily sideways into the snow just as a second sound reached the pass, a deep, rolling war horn note that echoed down from the high ridge above them, followed by a second and a third, and then the drumming of many hooves and the guttural war shout of a language Jacob had heard only once before. Murmured softly and lovingly in a stone tower, by the woman now standing frozen with her empty hand still raised. Ruka Ironjaw came down that ridge at the head of a dozen mounted Wildheart riders like something out of an old war song, her braided hair flying, her axe already swinging low and wide to take the legs out from under the nearest of Garrick's men. Jacob learned only later, in the relieved chaos of the following hour, that Lash had sent word to her father's honor guard the very night of the avalanche, trusting a Wildheart scout stationed secretly along the old boundary markers to carry it, in case Fjordholt's peace proved as thin as she had always feared it might. Ruka and her riders had been camped in the high passes for nearly 2 weeks, waiting, watching, honoring Lash's own order not to interfere unless she called, and the war horn on the ridge that morning had been her answer to a signal fire Jacob himself had lit at first light out of pure steward's habit, the same careful precaution he had once taken checking granary stores against a hard winter, never dreaming it might one day save both their lives. The skirmish, if it could even be called that, was over almost before it began. Outnumbered, outmatched, and abruptly facing a dozen orc riders with clear intent to avenge any harm done to their chieftain's daughter. Garrick's men broke and scattered within minutes, several throwing down their weapons outright. Garrick himself, disarmed by Ruka's second blow and dragged upright by the collar of his coat, was left kneeling in the trampled snow with his sword taken, and his pride entirely gone, while Jacob knelt in the same snow only a few feet away with Lash's arms locked so tightly around him he could hardly draw breath. "You reckless, wonderful, terrifying woman," he managed, his face pressed into her hair, his own hands shaking now that the danger had passed and there was finally time to feel it. "You would have let him take you." "I would have taken any bargain that kept you breathing," Lash said fiercely, pulling back only far enough to look at him, her thumbs wiping roughly at the tears she had not let herself shed until this exact moment. "I told you in the tower. I meant every word. You are not an arrangement to me, Jacob Maddox. You are not a duty or a treaty or a schedule I have kept. You are the choice. You have always been the choice." They freed Pell Ashwood, whose bound wrists Jacob himself cut loose with the boar spear's edge, and the boy wept with relief before finding the courage to spit, quite deliberately, in the snow at Garrick's feet. Ruka Ironjaw regarded the kneeling, broken champion of Fjordholt with the flat contempt of a warrior for a man who had needed 6 riders and a stolen bride to do what he could not accomplish honestly on a mountain, and it was her voice, cool and carrying, that settled the matter before Jacob had even gathered the words to try. "We ride to Fjordholt," Ruka said, in the halting trade tongue she had clearly practiced for this very purpose. "This one comes bound before your Jarl, so the whole hold sees what kind of man he chose over the truth, and the chieftain's daughter rides beside the man she has chosen for herself, so the whole hold sees that too." They came down out of the high pass 3 days later, the whole strange procession of them, Ruka's riders flanking a thoroughly humbled and thoroughly bound Garrick Stain, Pell Ashwood walking free and unafraid at the front, and Jacob and Lash riding together at the center of it all, her hand resting easy and possessive over his on the pony's reins, and the gates of Fjordholt opened to let them through into a yard that fell utterly silent at the sight. Jarl Osric Vane came out onto the steps of the long hall with his own guard at his back, his face carefully composed against whatever news this arrival might bring, and it was Ruka Ironjaw who spoke first, her trade tongue rough but her meaning unmistakable to every soul gathered in that yard. "Your champion rode into the mountains to murder your former steward and drag your bride home in chains," she said, loud enough to carry to the farthest wall. "He did this with 6 men and a bound boy as his witness, 3 days' ride from your hold, believing no one would ever know. He was wrong. Chieftain Cordeth Wildheart will hear of this, Osric Vane, and he will judge whether your piece is worth the paper it is written on." The Jarl's face had gone the color of old ash. "This was never sanctioned. I know that," Ruka said, cutting him off without ceremony. "That is not why I brought him back bound before your people instead of leaving him dead in the snow, which I promise you my riders wish to do. I brought him back so you would see, with your own eyes, exactly what kind of man you crowned champion of this hold, and exactly what kind of man you cast out of it." Every eye in that yard turned then, inevitably, to Jacob and Lash, still mounted together at the center of the procession, and Jacob felt the old familiar prickle of 100 hostile stares settle over him, the same stares that had greeted Lash at that very gate 3 months before. But this time, she did not sit still beside him and endure it. She swung down from the pony, crossed the frozen yard in a few long strides, and turned to face the whole assembled hold with the fierce, unhidden pride of a woman with nothing left to hide. "I came to this hold 3 months ago as a treaty," Lash said, her voice ringing clear across the silent yard, "sent by my father to buy a peace neither of our peoples had the courage to build with anything but marriage. I was given a champion I did not choose, arrangements I did not ask for, and a wedding date already carved into a ledger before I had even ridden through your gate. I ignored every one of them. Her eyes found Jacob's across the yard, and something in her whole bearing softened even as her voice stayed strong. Every arrangement your steward made for me, I set aside the wedding feast, the sewing lessons, the polite suppers with a man I found duller than a rock. I ignored all of it, because from the very first morning there was only one arrangement in this entire hold that I had any interest in keeping, and that was him. She crossed the last of the distance between them, and Jacob slid down from the pony to meet her, his heart hammering so loud he was certain the whole yard could hear it. "He tore up a lie in front of all of you rather than let it stand," Lash went on, not looking away from him even as she spoke to the crowd, "and he was cast out of his own home for it. He stood in front of a knife at his own throat and told me not to trade myself for his life, because he would rather die than see me pay that price. I have met warlords and warriors and chieftains' sons who call themselves brave, and not one of them has ever shown me courage like his. I do not want your champion, Osric Vane. I never wanted him. I want the steward who was given charge of every arrangement in my life and had the honesty and the heart to refuse the only one that mattered." Lash, Jacob's voice broke on her name, everything he had held carefully in check for 3 months finally breaking loose at once. "I have nothing to offer you. No hold, no title, no coin worth speaking of. I am a steward with no post, cast out of the only home I have known since I left the cloister." "You have offered me the only thing I have ever wanted from any man," Lash said, cupping his face in both hands, heedless of the entire hold watching, heedless of Garrick kneeling bound and humiliated not 30 feet away, heedless of a Jarl standing frozen on his own steps unable to find a single word to salvage his authority. "You looked at me the very first morning I rode through that gate as though I was a person worth seeing, not a treaty worth managing. You have looked at me that way every single day since. That is worth more to me than every hold and every hall and every crown my father's enemies have ever offered him for my hand. I do not need an arrangement, Jacob Maddox. I need you." "Then you have me," Jacob said, and his voice did not shake at all this time. "You have had me since the gate. I only needed the courage to say so where everyone could hear it." "Then say it now," Lash murmured, her brow pressed to his, "and let them all hear it." "I love you," Jacob said, loud enough that it carried to the farthest edge of that silent, staring yard. "I have loved you since you told me you did not care about my schedules, and I will go on loving you long after every ledger I have ever kept has turned to dust." And then, in front of the Jarl who had cast him out, in front of the champion who had tried to kill him, in front of the whole hold that had once turned its cold, hostile stares on the very woman now standing in his arms, Jacob kissed her not carefully, not quietly, not the way a steward kissed anything, but the way a man kisses the one thing in his whole life he refuses to lose again, fierce and open and utterly unashamed. Lash's arms closed around him just as fiercely, one hand fisting in the front of his coat exactly as it had that first night in the storehouse, and the yard that had gone silent in shock now broke, slowly, into something closer to a murmur of astonishment than outrage, even, here and there, a few low sounds that might almost have been approval. Jarl Osric Vane found his voice at last, though it came out rougher and smaller than the voice of a man who ruled a hold. "Ruka Ironjaw," he said, "tell your chieftain that Garrick Stain will answer for what he did in those mountains under whatever law he sees fit to impose, human or Wildheart both. Tell him also," and here the Jarl's eyes moved, grudging and tired, to the two figures still wrapped around each other in the center of his yard. "Tell him that whatever peace his daughter chooses to make for herself, this hold will honor it. I have made enough enemies of honest men this season. I will not make one more." It was not the sweeping, generous forgiveness of a man who had seen the error of his ways all at once. Jarl Osric Vane was too proud and too weary for that, but it was enough, and in the days that followed it proved to be more than enough. Garrick Stain was stripped of his title and sent to answer for his crimes before Chieftain Cordeth Wildheart's own justice. a fate the old hunters of the hold agreed was a good deal harsher than anything Fjordholt's laws alone might have managed. Pell Ashwood was given a place among the hold's hunters in his own right, his honesty finally worth more to the people around him than his silence would ever have been. And Jacob Maddox, though he did not ask for his stewardship back, and the Jarl did not think to offer it outright, found himself within a season quietly restored to it anyway, because there was no one else in the whole of Fjordholt who could keep its ledgers straight, and because, as the Jarl admitted once, gruffly, over a cup of winter ale, a hold that could not keep an honest steward did not deserve to call itself well governed. Lash Wildheart never did marry according to any arrangement made on her behalf. She married instead on a bright spring morning above the fjord, in a small ceremony of her own, choosing no treaty scroll, no ledger, no wedding feast dictated by anyone's schedule but her own, with her father's honor guard standing witness on one side, and the people of Fjordholt, warily but genuinely, gathering on the other, and Ruka Ironjaw grinning fierce, and approving from beside the makeshift altar of stacked mountain stone. Jacob stood across from her in the same plain wool coat he had worn the day she rode through the gate, and when at last the old orc rite was spoken and the binding cord wound about their joined wrists, he understood that every quiet, restless, unaccountable longing that had once driven him out of a cloister, and into a world he did not know how to belong to, had led him, all along, to exactly this moment, to a woman who had looked at a man the whole world overlooked and chosen, again and again, without hesitation, without regret, to keep him. No more arrangements, Lash murmured against his mouth, when the vows were done and the whole hold had finally, fully, begun to cheer. No more arrangements, Jacob agreed. Only you. And she kissed him again there above the black water of the fjord, in front of every person who had ever doubted them, and did not once let him go.